Hello everyone, welcome back to another video where today I'm going to be giving you my initial review and reaction to Season 2, Episode 5, The Story and the Engine. What an episode! Honestly, it's hard for me to even really process that whole thing because it was so dense and rich and interesting. I thought this was fantastic. I have no idea where it ranks or anything like that, but it's one that I'm definitely going to come back to in the months and years to come for sure. But before we get into it, feel free to subscribe if you're new, that would be greatly appreciated. We are trying to get to 30,000 subscribers by the end of the year, and any support would be greatly appreciated. We cover regular Doctor Who content here on the channel. Also, I had a haircut last night, which is pretty ironic given what this episode is about. The story essentially revolved around the Doctor taking the TARDIS to an old barbershop called Omo's Palace, and we get this really nice exchange towards the beginning of the episode between him and Belinda about the reason why he goes there is because this was the first time he had a black body and he wasn't quite used to kind of the stigma around that. So when he found Omo's Palace, he felt safe and secure in this barbershop telling stories, which I just thought was really lovely. But before then, we get the pre-credits where it shows some of the barbershop people sort of telling their stories, and you see the mural on the wall change, which is like a kind of projection of their stories, which I thought was a really, really cool visual, really, really nice. But yeah, so basically the Doctor lands in this barbershop, but something is awry. These people are said to be missing, and it's revealed that basically they're trapped inside this barbershop, but it's kind of a bit wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey. The barbershop itself exists at 2 points in the universe. One in Lagos, Nigeria, where it's supposed to be. The other basically on top of a spider in the middle of a web, basically. So, talking a little bit about characters here, I really love Ncuti's performance. I really do think that this series has been an all-timer standout series for him. I think this story in particular, I was really wanting because I was really wanting them to explore the Doctor's newfound race and the story opportunities that could bring. And I think that this is a great case study in showing what new stories that diverse casting can bring to the show. Because we wouldn't have a story like this otherwise. At least it wouldn't feel as authentic and as real as it does. But essentially, yeah, so getting back to the plot, it's revealed that Omo, who's the original barbershop owner, has basically been replaced by a new guy who is just called the Barber, I think, for most of the runtime. And it's basically revealed that they are constantly cutting hair to fuel something because it fuels off of stories, essentially. And he has an assistant or an associate who comes and brings them food in the meantime because they're the only two that can walk between Lagos, Nigeria and the spider. And there's so many little moments in this episode that I absolutely love. I love the Doctor telling the story of Belinda Chandra. I thought that was lovely. That whole sequence with her in the hospital and basically revealing that despite it being her nan's birthday, she had to stay there all night and look after this woman, and that woman did, basically say, thanks, I know what you did. We get their Mrs. Flood cameo there, so there it is. A smaller one this week, but I think that was a good idea, given that this episode, I feel like if you'd have put her in this episode, as in physically in this episode, it would kind of have detracted from the overall sort of vibe of the story, if that makes any sense, because she's such a campy character and such a very Doctor Who-y villain that I feel that because this episode felt so different in a good way, she would have felt out of place somehow. So I'm glad they confined her to a flashback this week. I love just watching the Doctor fully embrace himself in the culture and just enjoying it. That's a very Doctor-like thing. Obviously, Belinda is still adamant to get home, so she stays in the TARDIS to wait for the Doctor while he, has a minute in Nigeria because he says, it's somewhere that I feel happy. And I'm really glad that they're keeping up this fact that as much as she enjoys his company, there is still that element of, look, I really want to go home. So I'm glad that they didn't just drop that after the first couple episodes. One of my only major criticisms of this episode is the lack of Belinda. I personally love Belinda Chandra, and I think, that flashback scene is really good. I think she's one of the best companions we've had in a very long time. But I think it's unfortunate for the majority of the runtime of this. She's either in the TARDIS, or eventually she makes her way out to the barbershop, to the Doctor, to try and help him, but she's largely in the background, because this is really, like, Ncuti's focal piece, which is fine, but I feel like because we're only on 8 episodes, and because last week already was a Doctor and Companion Light episode with Ruby instead of Belinda, I almost feel it's a shame that, we've only got one regular episode left where Belinda can be the companion properly before the finale, where I'm assuming all sorts of things are going to happen. So that's my only real criticism of this one, but I think part of that is also sort of down to just the nature of the runtime of a series. 8 episodes, I still don't think it's enough, especially for a series like this with its ambition and its scale. As much as I do think that they've done a better job this year of accounting for that than last year, I still just feel that I was feeling the absence of Belinda, because I do really like her character, as much as I was loving everything in the barbershop. The Doctor goes into this barbershop and they're like, right, well, you tell a story then. So they sit him down, and of course it's revealed essentially that when they tell a story and when the barber cuts the hair, it's connected up to the spider which powers it, essentially. And he tells the story of Belinda, like I say, but it gets revealed essentially that his stories and his storytelling ability is like enough to fully charge the spider pretty much in one go, which makes total sense. And obviously his assistant, very early on, it's established that she knows the Doctor from somewhere. Now, initially, I was like, oh, is she a Time Lord? Because I was even thinking about the way the door works, kind of existing in two places at once, is very Time Lordy. Well, initially, we all think that the barber is the main kind of god-like figure. He says, I'm Loki, I'm Anansi, I'm all these different characters, and we get this really nice animation. I'm basically the origin point of all gods. And the Doctor kind of laughs that off and kind of says, no, I've met Loki. We sat and watched Marvel movies together, and they weren't a fan, they weren't a big fan of how small Thor's muscles were, and stuff like that, which was really funny. But yeah, it gets revealed essentially that he is lying, and in fact, he is basically a servant of the gods, whose role was to basically spread the word of their stories, and by doing so, would kind of increase the power of the gods. And he basically helped them to connect all of humanity through a web to the gods, which is what the spider is walking on. The Nexus, I believe it's called. You see what I mean? This is a very dense story, so I'm having to go through a lot of, details here. But basically, after all these years, he's feeling like he wasn't really credited for helping the rise of the gods. I wonder if part of the reason why we're seeing more gods, obviously I know part of it's the salt, but I wonder if part of it is also him telling these stories, magnifying them in the way that he has been. Because as well, when he's explaining his role, we get a shot of the Palazzo Picture Palace, which was the cinema in Lux. So that kind of suggests to me that he is in some way using his stories to supercharge these gods, or at least kind of hasten their arrival in some sort of way, which I thought was interesting. Maybe he was the one that left the spoon there, who knows? I like the implication that, by sort of telling these stories and spreading it in books and stuff, that's their way of gaining power. I thought that was very, very interesting. There's a bit of a betrayal, because the woman says, oh yeah, he is going to become the king of the gods. He's finally going to get the credit he deserves, sit atop the gods, and basically rule justly. And the Doctor says, why would he sit at the top of something that he despises? And then it's revealed that essentially what he wants to do is essentially, rather than go to the gods and basically take his place at the top, he wants to basically break off the ties between the gods and humanity on this web. Which initially I was like, oh, maybe the Doctor would support that, because obviously the gods haven't exactly been doing him any favours of recent, but it turns out that by doing that, you would put the lives of 7 billion people at risk, because of course, gods and humans are inherently connected, but also that's where stories come from, and basically people wouldn't be able to tell any stories if that was the case. So instead, what the Doctor does is he basically supercharges the engine, or the spider in this case, with his own stories. He connects himself to the tree, which is like the central hub of the engine, and he basically overloads it with his stories and his memories, and we get some really cool flashes of, different Doctor Who episodes, which I thought was actually really tasteful, because sometimes when Doctor Who appears on screens, I'm a bit like, oh, it's a bit too much like a member berry type situation. But in this case, it makes sense, because the whole point is it's fueled by stories, and no one has more stories than the Doctor. And the Doctor has a really nice line towards the beginning of this episode, which is, you want stories of weeping angels and ice warriors, but there is no story more, I think, impactful than the human life, which I thought was a very Doctor-y line. I also love his hat. Very unrelated, but it very much gives, First Doctor hat, which I really like. Don't know whether that was intentional, but I just thought it was a fun point to note. But yeah, it essentially gets revealed that the woman who is associated with the barber is in fact the daughter of Anansi. But not only that, she once basically tried to be saved by the Doctor. And the Doctor's like, hang on, I don't know you. But it basically gets revealed that the Doctor who she wanted to save her was the fugitive. So, it happened basically, pre the Doctor's memory, which is why he didn't remember this woman initially. And it was really fun seeing the cameo of Jo Martin. Obviously, I did hear rumours about it beforehand, which is a bit of a shame, because I feel like for some people that probably, makes it a bit less exciting when it happens. But I still really liked it, and I thought it was a good way of incorporating her. Obviously, there's a part of me that's never going to love the implication of pre-Hartnell Doctors. However, if you're going to do it, this is probably the most tasteful implementation of it. Basically, there is a character who knows the Doctor and seems to be aware of them, and he doesn't know why, and basically revealing that she wanted to be saved from her father, the god, and the fugitive Doctor basically goes, look, I was in my own story at the time, and I was a fugitive back then, and I was in my own story that will maybe one day get an ending, and I was like, yeah, sure, okay. That felt like a bit of a tease, because we all know the Timeless Child stuff very much was kind of left on a who knows kind of thing, and same goes for the fugitive Doctor. But I liked the way they incorporated her, and it was nice to see Jo Martin on screen again. I like that her costume is just entirely the same. If I had one issue with it would be that I'm slightly confused as to how much the Doctor is supposed to remember and not remember, because obviously he refers to himself as being in his first black body at the start of the story, which I guess would be accurate from his perspective, because he doesn't remember all the Timeless Child lives and Doctors and stuff. But then he does eventually remember the events of the fugitive Doctor. It just takes him a while. So I'm a bit confused as to how much the Doctor's actually supposed to know about the past. Do they know about individual adventures? Do they just know about the fugitive? Do they know about all the pre-Hartnell Doctors? I don't think this is really a fault of this episode in particular. I think this is more a fault of the Timeless Child, frankly, and the can of worms that it opens. And I'm kind of glad that they didn't go in depth on that. I just can imagine maybe casual audiences being a bit confused, because the Doctor is very adamant that this is my first black body at the start, only to then see, a black woman be the Doctor years prior. If I was a casual audience or a Disney Plus subscriber who maybe this was my first era of Doctor Who, I'd be sat there a bit well, hang on a minute, you said that was your first black body, but now you're saying there was one before, but you didn't remember it. It does create a level of confusion and a level of distance, I feel, from the casual audience and the programme. As well incorporated as I think it is, I do just think that, it's quite messy, and I think that the more you tug at that, the less it really holds together. Again, I know that it's just a fun cameo, and I was happy to see it again, but it was just something I was thinking about as I saw it. I was like, how is this playing to people who don't know about the Timeless Child? Do you know what I mean? Because this is supposed to be season 2 of a new era. We've gone away with a lot of the traditional villains. It's supposed to be this kind of new reboot of the show, and yet we're carrying on this piece of lore that's not only incredibly complicated and a bit convoluted, but also incredibly controversial, which I understand the predicament of you don't want to just write over the last guy, but I also sort of think as a new audience member, I just wonder how that scene plays. Do you know what I mean? Because as fans, we all go, oh cool, it's the fugitive Doctor, but to normal people, are they going, Who's that? Do you know what I mean? Like, I think about when my mum eventually watches this episode, how is she going to react to that? You just really feel a connection to the side cast in this story, even though, you know, we only get to know them very fleetingly. Omo, and particularly the barber, I think, are very, very good characters. And the side characters who are the ones getting their haircuts, you know, we don't get much from them, but what we do get is enough to make them likeable and to make them endearing. Visually, I thought this episode was fantastic. Apparently, all the stuff in Lagos, Nigeria was actually just Cardiff, which, as someone who lives in Cardiff, I wouldn't have known. You know, I'm not probably someone who can speak to its authenticity, but it looked great to me. Another scene I really loved was the scene towards the end where the woman, who is the daughter of an Anansi, is basically cutting the Doctor's hair, and she tells a story of how slaves would basically cut the pathways to escape into their hair, and obviously so their masters wouldn't notice. And then that gets used later on where the Doctor is trying to get to the central hub of the engine to stop it and to free the people inside the barbershop, and he uses his hair to track it. Stuff like that I just thought was a really good kind of like setup and payoff. The direction of this episode is absolutely fantastic. It looks gorgeous, and I've got to give praise, as always, but especially for this episode, to Murray Gold. I thought his soundtrack was really unique, really different, but also really, really good. I don't get people who just say that he does the same thing all the time. Like, yes, I know he does reuse tracks, but man, come on, that was like some really good, like, new, interesting music. I think it's just a shame that we never seem to get soundtracks anymore. Maybe one day, but yeah. This is another one that I largely felt the pacing of was pretty good. Like, I didn't really feel like I was missing too much. I think probably this is one that's going to benefit from a rewatch because a lot of information is exposited, and I think first time, you know, this early in the morning, I may have missed a couple of bits and bobs, but I think I got most of everything. I'm just having a double check. But yeah, I thought this was a really unique, really different episode that offered a fresh perspective on the Doctor Who universe and just the Doctor in general. I thought that it felt very authentic. I think Inuit Ellams, obviously this is his first time writing Doctor Who, and I believe, is this his first TV writing gig? I think so. If it is, hats off to you, mate. You did incredibly well. Incredibly well. I guess that's one thing you can say, even though I think he made the transition into a episode pretty organically. I think this episode is quite wordy, and you can almost tell that his background is as a poet and as a playwright. And I probably would have liked a couple more moments of just showing and not telling as much. But I think that's probably something that can be refined over time. As I said, if this was his first TV gig, you know, he did better than I could do, I'll tell you that. I think the thing that I'm just sad about is that this was episode 5, and we've only got 3 episodes left of this. Because I think this series has been rock solid so far. I can probably anticipate that this episode will likely stir up the most controversy or vitriol, but to be quite honest, I think this was an absolutely wonderful story and a great way of executing it. But yeah, I thought I'd acknowledge that because I know it's coming eventually, and as soon as I post this, most probably. But Doctor Who in its original form was always about, you know, educating in terms of obviously different parts of history and different world events and science and stuff. So the logical extension of that, in my opinion, is to cover other cultures as well, you know? Oh yeah, also, there is a kid who appears when Belinda is trying to find the Doctor. I completely forgot about this. And I've seen people point it out since. This could well be Captain Poppy. She's like, oh yeah, this weird kid just sort of appeared. And the Doctor says at the end, oh, stories are leaking out. So, is that to do with the finale? Again, I have heard rumours of, like, space babies being relevant somewhat in the finale, but that definitely was the same girl. Although it is baffling to see her, like, walking around, you know, even though it's just like a year ago, you know, she's just in a little seat, you know, but that's just how babies grow, I guess. But yeah, I think one of my favourite performances is definitely the barber, and I like that he's redeemed at the end, because really, it's not his fault. He was basically forced into serving the gods. He started off as a human, but basically was forced into it at a young age. And I like that he gets redeemed at the end, and Omo finally gets free from the shop and goes, I'm retiring, which, fair enough, if you get stuck in a shop that long. So he hands off the barbershop to the barber, and he takes a new name, the name of Omo's father, whose name I can't quite remember. I'll have to do a rewatch for that. I also love the Doctor's 6-word summary of his life. I'm born, I die, I'm born. Because it's accurate. That's what happens to the Doctor. He's born in a new body, he dies, and he is reborn again. I also loved the genuine sense of betrayal in the Doctor when he realises that Omo deliberately kind of lured him into this scenario to tell a story to try and help himself. But then he does forgive Omo in the end because it's a bit of a bonkers situation, and like, if there's anyone who you think is going to tell a good story to help you get out of this situation, it would be the Doctor. So, yeah, that makes sense. And I also love the story at the beginning with Omo as well, of how they met. They met in a fire because his village was on fire, but the Doctor appears in the TARDIS and, uses a giant hose to spray it all away. I thought that was lovely. I thought that was all really, really good as well. Really nice bit of world building, and you understand the connection that these two characters have, even though, their dialogue isn't exactly like the most plentiful in the episode. But what were your thoughts on the story and the engine? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you did enjoy this video, be sure to give it a like, subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you later.